When Mr. Gorbachev signs the missile treaty here at the White House with President Reagan, what will it mean for his revolution at home and our future in Britain?
And from Moscow, we report on the power struggle inside the Kremlin that threatens to send Mikhail Gorbachev to America, politically weaker than he's been at any time since he came to power.
Good evening and welcome to This Week, on the eve of what is being billed, and perhaps for once without exaggeration, as an historic moment. A summit between the superpowers here in Washington, where Mr. Gorbachev and President Reagan will sign an agreement to eliminate an entire category of nuclear weapons. Tonight, I'll be asking Gennady Gerasimov, Mr. Gorbachev's chief spokesman on foreign affairs, about Moscow's purpose and what it would mean for Europe and especially for us in Britain. The months leading up to this summit have been fraught with uncertainty. Indeed, only a few weeks ago, it looked for a moment as though it might be called off altogether. All eyes turned to Moscow, where it soon emerged that Mr. Gorbachev was engaged in a bitter political struggle, which went to the very heart of the new Soviet revolution, of which this summit forms an integral part. Therefore, we start tonight in Moscow, where Margaret Jay reports on the battle in the Kremlin.
I would go as far as to suggest that we are witnessing the emergence of the political spectrum in the Soviet Union, of different opinions and viewpoints. I would be hesitant to use the traditional Western, notions of left and right and liberal and conservative. They do not fit the Soviet reality, but I probably would rather use the terms like reformist and traditionalist.
For most Soviet citizens, more concerned with making ends meet than with sophisticated political debate, life still seems drably the same. Muscovites are facing the third hard winter of the Gorbachev era, and there's no real change in living standards or what you can buy in the state-run shops.
Practical changes, material and social changes in the lives of people outside the intelligentsia have so far been very few.
Shoes and other everyday goods are still in short supply. Last week, an enormous queue waited patiently in freezing temperatures when a delivery suddenly appeared in one shop. Patience, acceptance have become part of Soviet life. For Mr. Gorbachev, it's a mixed blessing. It gives him more time to sort things out before he gets really unpopular. On the other hand, the people's lethargy and cynicism make it very difficult to energize the economy.
We haven't yet improved our technology so that we can speed up economic and social change. We haven't yet made the necessary changes in management. We think that a substantial improvement in people's lives should start to show in 2 or 3 years. Our aim is for every family to start enjoying the fruits of Perestroika in the next few years.
Well, let me be very frank. Sometimes I feel that, well, if I were God, I would prefer to move some of the things more quicker than I see now. Look, we began with the notion of acceleration, ускорение, okay? And it took us, how long? Half a year, maybe? To realize that you really cannot accelerate something which doesn't move. And you should be much more radical in the reforms. And then the battle cry was reconstruction, or rather reformation, perestroika. We understood that we should not simply accelerate something, we should change in the first place the system, and then make the system move again.
Over the last 12 months, brightly painted kiosks, so-called Yeltsin Chaos, appeared all over the city. Here, individual producers could sell their goods at state-regulated prices. This woman had duck and sausage and mayonnaise to offer. But last Saturday morning, she was the only person doing business. Further along the road, a smallholder had driven a lorry in with a few fresh carrots and potatoes. He too was soon surrounded by eager customers. A few yards away was the familiar sight of a queue outside a badly stocked state store. Yeltsin had tried to create different markets, but now the shuttered, empty kiosks seemed an apt symbol of Yeltsin's failed attempts to try and make life easier for his fellow citizens. He couldn't beat the system, and now the system has beaten him. He felt frustrated at every turn by what he saw as an obstructive machine and a feeble national leadership. This autumn, Yeltsin took his frustrations inside the Kremlin to the Central Committee of the party. The October meeting here wasn't like the usual controlled deliberations because Boris Yeltsin exploded and made an angry, emotional speech. The speech has never been published, but it's reported that he attacked the Kremlin leaders for going too slowly and accused Mikhail Gorbachev of the cult of personality and building his own image. In the Kremlin, there were hurried, secret consultations. Gorbachev and his colleagues decided to try and disguise the domestic political problem for a few weeks and to send their foreign minister Shevardnadze back to Washington to try and resurrect the December summit. Meanwhile, the Moscow bureau of the New York Times had learned the inside story of what had caused the embarrassing diplomatic hold-up. On the same day that Shevardnadze met Reagan, the paper published a report by Philip Taubman linking the Yeltsin row to the summit delay.
I happened to hear it from somebody who I think has good sources in the Central Committee and even on the Politburo. And he pulled me aside at one point and indicated that there had been a disruption at the last Central Committee meeting, which was on October 21st, and that Yeltsin, he said, had attacked Gorbachev.
Did you get a feeling that it was this political crisis rather than anything to do with the terms of the treaty, which was making them delay the date for the summit?
It seemed to me during that weekend and the following week after the Schultz visit that there needed to be some explanation beyond diplomatic reasons for this very bizarre behavior by Gorbachev. I mean, ever since he's taken office, he's been very adept at projecting an image of a very reasonable man, somebody who moves along very deliberately. And for the first time, suddenly, he is disrupting the schedule for a meeting, great meeting of great importance to him, and then 4 or 5 days later, he's suddenly dispatching Shevardnadze on a rather almost unseemly haste to Washington to resurrect the summit.
The Kremlin crisis was now out in the open, and soon a Soviet news conference confirmed that Yeltsin had attacked Gorbachev and threatened to resign. But no sooner had this story appeared on the Russian wire service than an official instruction was sent to prevent it being printed. It is categorically recommended not to publish the answer about Boris Yeltsin. Ironically, all of Moscow can now listen to unjammed broadcasts from the West. So the new Glasnost allows Soviet citizens to hear about domestic politics this way, if not from their own media, where old-style censorship persists.
In fact, the Yeltsin affair was, I think, the best example we've had of a double standard that is developed in Glasnost, in that there are some things that are made available for consumption in the West, and there's some things that are not available here.
3 weeks ago, the Moscow Party Committee met and sacked Mr. Yeltsin. The way in which he was sacked has dismayed many people. Pravda publicly reported 24 speeches led by Mr. Gorbachev vilifying Yeltsin in a way which brought chilly memories of the past. Muscovites were stunned to read that Yeltsin, who they'd thought of as a hero of the new regime, was now being accused of every crime in the political book. Pravda printed column after column of denunciation. One speaker accused him of treachery, another spoke of pseudo-revolutionary posturing. He was called a demagogue and an adventurer. In response, Yeltsin meekly agreed that he had lost face as a communist leader.
Yeltsin,
he was saying one thing but doing something else. He dealt harshly with the staff. There were many unfair sackings. There was no democracy, although he kept talking about democracy. A large number of programs were announced, and he talked well about them, for the improvement of supplies for the Muscovites, of the health service and so on, but very little was done. People could see that.
But the people on the streets of Moscow were dismayed by Yeltsin's dismissal. There was amazement that today's Glasnost permitted party debate to be published, and horror that the debate sounded like a show trial from a darker past. Support for Yeltsin has been spearheaded by activists called Perestroika clubs, who want reform to come quickly. They're small groups who meet in flats all over Moscow and have been organising petitions and protests since Yeltsin fell. Last Sunday, this club of young people talked about what they should do next. They don't want to see a slide back to the old ways, and they're worried that this may now be a real threat.
Так сложилось, что Ельцин – это человек-миф, так же, как Perestroika.
Yeltsin happened to be a legend of Perestroika, identified with the early legend of Perestroika itself. This is why many people saw Yeltsin's sacking as an attempt to kill off Perestroika.
Понимается многими как покушение на миф перестройки.
Я думаю, что в этих речах проявился, к сожалению...
I think that, unfortunately, the speeches reflected the apparatchiks' craving for revenge. Revenge against a leader who dealt rather sternly with the apparatchiks themselves.
Достаточно жестко поступал с аппаратчиками, пытался опираться через...
He tried to find support by appealing over their heads, directly to the population, or to the more progressive bureaucrats.
Другие нетрадиционные слои чиновников.
Every Soviet citizen is obsessed by the lessons of the past. For the last 6 months, this previously private cemetery has been open to the public, and a steady stream of visitors has come to the obscure grave of Nikita Khrushchev, the reforming Russian leader of 20 years ago, whose career ended in disgrace. The fate of Khrushchev must always be in Mr. Gorbachev's mind. The last leader to try and reform both the party and the economy was overwhelmed by the forces of opposition. Khrushchev was a less sophisticated politician than Gorbachev. His disciples might say he was a more genuine radical. There's no doubt that Gorbachev will press on with his attempts at change. But inside the Kremlin, he'll have to tread carefully. The Yeltsin affair has shown that the inner circles of the party still contain many who prefer stagnant comfort to uncertain change.
Margaret Jay on the uncertainty of the Gorbachev revolution, an uncertainty which bears directly on this summit in Washington. Not only on the INF treaty to be signed here next week, but also on the next stage, the moves towards a massive cut in strategic missiles and thus the prospect for a new era in superpower relations. What will this mean for Europe and for Britain? Gennady Gerasimov is Mr. Gorbachev's chief spokesman on foreign affairs. First, could I ask you, apart from mutual expressions of goodwill, what does Mr. Gorbachev hope to achieve from his meeting when he stops off in London on his way here?
Well, I guess it's a refueling stop, and there will be also fueling of ideas from one side to another and vice versa. So it will be, I hope, exchange of views which will be helpful for everybody.
Why particularly Mrs. Thatcher and not any other European leader?
I think because we developed a good, friendly, personal relationship between our leaders. This is point number one. And second, we listen to what the Prime Minister is going to say.
Do you regard her as in many ways, the most significant European figure now? Is that why?
Well, I don't think we can just play this game, who is important, who is less important. But I think this stopover and this short working visit shows that we are concerned not only with Soviet-American relations, important as they are, but also with relations with European countries.
But there is, as you know, considerable anxiety in Europe about the conventional weapons. While your strategic missiles in the Soviet Union, you could lower the sights, put less fuel in the rocket, so to speak, and you could still attack Western Europe, with Western Europe not from the soil of Western Europe being able to retaliate.
Well, we are not going to attack anybody. But theoretically speaking, you are right in a sense that this particular treaty, which is going to be signed, good as it is, as step number one, cannot stand on its own feet for too long, because really we can use other missiles just to retarget them. That's right, or missiles in English. So we must follow this step number one with the second step, which is cutting in half which is not yet cutting to size our nuclear arsenals.
You say it can't stand on its own for very long. What sort of timescale does it have before either you retarget or NATO feels obliged to put in other weapons to replace the departing cruise and
It cannot
Pershings?
stand on its own feet because on the American side or NATO side, you can add American bombers with nuclear bombs to your arsenal, or just put forward your submarines or just ships with cruise missiles, or missiles, sorry, cruise missiles with nuclear warheads. So it is the beginning, but it must be supported by other steps.
What would happen? What would be the Soviet response? What would you either say or do if the other steps weren't achieved quickly, and as a consequence, NATO decided to deploy, for instance, cruise missiles in aeroplanes based in Europe and particularly in Britain?
But this is one way to undermine the treaty. The idea of the treaty is to get away with these intermediate missiles in Europe. And if you are going to introduce substitutes, then it means that you're going to ruin the whole treaty. I hope it is not in the plans.
Do you expect there to be a treaty signed cutting strategic weapons by half early next summer?
That's our proposed timetable, so to say. And we think that it's possible if there is political will on both sides, and all those details can be dealt with.
Can you confirm that if the treaty on strategic weapons does go ahead, that it will have no effect on Britain's capacity to buy and deploy the Trident missile as Britain's independent deterrent?
Well, it's your business, so that's for you to decide. But my hope is that if we go successfully down the road of nuclear disarmament, then this particular issue is going to be obsolete.
Is going to be obsolete?
Obsolete.
Why obsolete?
Because if we are going seriously to have nuclear disarmament, then at a certain stage, Britain and France will join the process, as I understand. Otherwise, we cannot disarm till zero unless we involve other nuclear powers, which